So back over in our user controller under the admin namespace, we can just get rid of our die and dump. And what we want to do is get all the users and then pass them down to the view. And there's multiple ways you can pass data down to the views. So I'm just going to create a new variable here called users. I'm going to set this equal to user, and then I'm going to say get all users. And then underneath this, we can just return a view. And then we'll just tell it what view we want to return. So I haven't created this yet, but I'm going to be creating a new folder, and I'm going to create a new folder called admin. And then inside of there, I'm going to create another folder called users, and then I'm going to create a blade file called index. This just helps us keep everything together. So all the views in our admin user controller that we're currently in are all going to be in that one folder. Now we just need to pass down all of our users to the view so the view can use it. Now one way you can do this is by calling the with method. And then the with method takes an array of items, and we can say we want to put a key in here called users. And then we want to put our users data in there that we got from up here. Then that'll just pass down all our users that we got out of the database here into the view with a variable called users. Now we could get rid of this variable. So we could call users all and just put that in there like that. And we get rid of that variable altogether. And normally with this, I'll break this down onto another line to make it more readable. And then the same for the key value pairs. Because we're only passing one bit of data down at the moment, but we could be passing multiple bits of data down. So for example, we could create another key for our roles. Then we could get the roles from the table and send all of them down. So this makes it easy to read as the application expands. But for now, let's just get rid of that. And then another option you don't have to call the with method. You can just actually pass it in as a second parameter here. So let's just delete that with method here. Let's just get rid of this here and put a comma in. And then turn this into an array. And obviously just close that off. Now we don't have to use that with method. We can just pass this in as a second parameter. So this passes the data down exactly the same. And again, you can separate this out on another line if you wish. And then you can just keep chaining on the key value pairs in the array, just like I showed you previously in that example. So that's another option for you. So I'll leave that up to you, whichever one you want to choose. For this series, I'm going to be using this method where I pass an array in as a second parameter to the view method. And don't forget, all the text in the light grey here is being injected by my IDE. You don't need to type that, just there to make development easier so I know what I need to pass into the methods. And finally, because we're using this user model here, you need to make sure you bring that into the file at the top. Now again, this is something PHP Storm automatically brings in for you, and any competent IDE will also do the same. But if you're just using a basic text editor, it probably won't bring this in automatically for you. So at the top of your file, make sure you call the use app models user. So the next thing we want to do is create these folders and create the index view. So under our resources folder and views, we want to just create a new folder here. And we're going to call this one admin. And then inside of this admin folder, let's create another folder called users. And then inside of here, we just need to create a new file. And we're calling that one index.blade.php. So inside of this file, we just need to extend from our main template. So I'm just going to open up the index file in the root of our views folder. I'm just going to copy this over and just paste this in here. And for the H1 tag, I'm just going to put users. Now let's just refresh this in the browser to make sure it's working. And you can see now we go to /admin/users and we get our users view. So now let's just print out our users. So back over in our admin users index template, let's just come down a line here. And I'm going to create a new div with a class of card. Now this is Bootstrap specific class. So if you're not using Bootstrap, then obviously use whatever the alternative is in your framework of choice. And then inside of this card, I'm going to create a table and loop over the data. So I'm just going to copy and paste the table from the Bootstrap docs. So over in the docs, I'm just going to copy this basic table they've got here. And I'm going to paste this inside of the card. And then for the headings, I'm just going to put ID next to the hash there. For the next column, I'm going to do name. For the third column, I'm going to do email. And for the final column, I'm just going to put actions. And this is where we're going to put the buttons for edit and delete. Okay, so now what we can do is just loop over our users and print out a new table row for each of them. So we can call the blade syntax for each. Then we want to say for each users. And this variable called users is being passed down from our user controller. So we can see here we called it users. So whatever name you give here is the name of the variable. We want to say for each of those users as user. And let's just close off that for each loop down here. Then inside of here, we just want to build up that syntax. So I'm just going to copy this first row, put that in here. And then for there, we just want to open up our blade syntax. We want to say the current user in this loop. So we can say user and just print out their ID. And then for the next row, we want to do the user and their name. The third row, we want to do user and their email address. And for the final row, I'm just going to delete this holder text, but this is where we're going to be putting our buttons in, and I'll do that shortly. So let's take a look at this now. So I'm just going to refresh this. You can see there now, this loops over all of our users that we injected in the previous video and just prints them out onto the screen. So this doesn't look too great because the table goes right up to the edge of the card. So I'm just going to add a little bit of styling here to make this look a little bit better. Now don't forget, if you haven't already, in the background, make sure npm run watch is running. And this will look for any changes in your SAS files or your JS and instantly compile it for you. So whenever you're making a change to your JS or your SAS, you just need to make sure that that npm method is running in the background. So over in our project under resources, SAS, let's open up our app.scss file. And then I'm just going to scroll down to the bottom. And then in here, I'm going to reference that card class. And I'm going to give this a box shadow. I'm going to say 0, 2 pixels, 4 pixels. So it gives it a nice tight shadow around the card. And we're going to give this a RGBA value so we can make it semi-transparent. Then like we did on our nav bar, I'm going to call 204, 204, 204 grey color. I'm going to give this a higher opacity number of 0.8, so it makes it darker in appearance. And then I'm going to add some padding, and I'm going to do 20 pixels and 40 pixels. Let's take a look at this. So as you can see there now, that puts padding around our table so it looks a bit better. And it also gives this card a little bit of a drop shadow tight up against it. I think that's looking good now. I think maybe a little bit more of a margin below the header one here. So I'm just going to come up towards the top and do a H1 here. And I'm just going to give this H1 tag a margin bottom of 30 pixels. And that just spaces the page content out a little bit from the heading. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is add in the action buttons here. So back over in our index.blade.php file, I'm just going to break this down onto another line so it's easy to read. And we're going to create a anchor tag with the class of btn. I'm going to make this a small button, so it's going to be a btn sm. And I'm going to give this btn primary. Then I'm going to give this a href. And we're going to open up our blade syntax in here. And we're going to call that root helper method, which we've used many times. Now I'll just scroll along so this is easier to read on your screen. And then we want this to link to our admin root. And we want it to go to users.edit. And if we just take a look at this edit route now, it goes to the edit method on the user controller. And you can see here, it's expecting an ID to be passed into it. And this is the ID of the current user that we want to edit. So inside of our root here, as a second parameter, so the first parameter is the name of the root. The second parameter is going to be the user and their ID. So this is the current user inside of this for each loop. And I'm going to give this a row of button. And then I'm just going to close off this anchor tag now. And then the content of the anchor tag is going to be edit. Let's check this out. And you see now we have our edit buttons. And let's just click one at random here. So number 5. You can see that takes us to the URL of user5 edit. So now let's add in our delete button. So if you remember correctly, when we did our logout part, that required a post request. But when you're deleting a user, that requires a delete request. Now, a lot of browsers don't really support this. So you have to send a post request. But Laravel has a method that you can pass in so it knows that you're sending a delete request. So because this needs to be a post request, we need to do this via a form. So we can just create a new form here. So let's just create our form here. And the action for our form, And we're going to open up our blade syntax and use that root method helper again. And the action is going to go to admin.users.destroy. And then again, like the edit, this needs the user ID that we want to destroy. So we can call user ID. And we're going to set this to a method of post. And then we don't actually want to show this form because we're going to create a button that will submit this form just like we did in the logout. So we can call style, and we want to say the style display none. And then inside of this form, as with any Laravel form, we need our CSRF token. And then also, as I mentioned, because we're sending this a post, but Laravel is expecting a delete, we can pass in another blade helper called method. And then inside of this method, we can just call delete. So Laravel now knows, even though we're sending a post request, which most of the browsers support, it's actually going to be a delete request internally to Laravel. Okay, so now each of these forms is going to be exactly the same as we loop over each of the users. So we need to find a way of giving this form a unique ID, so our JavaScript knows which form to submit. So let's just give this an ID here. I'm going to give this a name of delete-user-form. And then on the end here, we're going to open up our blade syntax and we're going to say user ID. So for now, each of the rows, this form is going to have a unique ID, and it's going to be equal to delete user form and then whatever the user ID is on the end. So now when we create our delete button, we can target the form that is on the row for this user. Okay, so now we need to create the button that's going to submit this form. I'm going to give this a type of button and then give some classes for styling. So I'm going to use the same as the button above for the edits, btn small. And then finally btn, and instead of primary, I'm going to say danger, so it gives us a red button. And then I'm just going to close this button off for now. I'm going to break this down onto a new line so it's easier to read. And the button text is going to be delete. So just the same as our logout, we want to put a bit of JavaScript in here to prevent the default action of this button and instead submit the form below it. So inside of this button here, let's add a new attribute. I'm going to break this down on another line so it's easier to read. And I'm just going to say on click, and on click we want to grab the event is the click, and we want to say prevent default. So that stops the button actually doing anything. And then once we've prevented the default, so we'll do a semicolon here, we then want to submit the form below. So I'm just going to break this down into a new line again so it's easier to read. And then once we've prevented the default, we want to submit this form. So we first need to grab the form and then submit it. So we can do document, and we want to get an element by its ID. And then that ID, we want it to be equal to the form below us here. So we're going to say delete user from. And you can see my ID just filled that in for me here. So we're going to delete user from and then the current user ID. So that is how we link the form on each of the lines of the table to this delete button. If we didn't do this and we just click delete, it would find the first form. And the first form would be the top row. So it would always delete the top row. It wouldn't delete the user that you wanted. And now we've got that form below us, we just want to call submit. And then that would submit the form below. Let's just take a look at this in the browser because we've got a better idea of what's going on. So here we can see now, we can see our delete buttons. And let's take row 8, for example. So I'm just going to right click this and inspect. This might be a little bit small, so I'll just zoom in. Now you can see here our JavaScript is saying get the element by ID where it is delete user form 8. And then you can see here our hidden form has the ID of delete user form 8. So when we click this delete button, our JavaScript knows we want to submit this form. And this form submits to admin users /8. So that's how we make each row understand what user we want to delete. So let's just open another one at random here, number 4. And you can see here now we're saying delete user form 4. And our hidden form here has the ID of delete user form 4. And that is submitting our delete method to admin users 4. Okay, so we have our edit and delete. So finally, I'm just going to add a create button at the top. So I'm going to do this up next to the title here. So I'm just going to create a new div. I'm going to give this a class of row. And then inside of here, I'm going to give a div class. Then I'm going to create a column of 12, which will go across the full span of the container. And then inside of here, I'm going to put the h1 tag. I'm going to give this a class of float left, so it sits to the left of the page. And then I'm going to do a create button that will sit to the right. So in a similar way to our edit button, let's just go down and copy that. I'm just copying this edit button here. And then I'm going to put that next to the H1 tag. And then in the classes, I'm going to change that from primary to success. So we get a green button. And I'm also going to say float to the right. And then for the href, we want that to go to admin users create. And because we're creating something new, we don't need to pass in a user ID. We can keep the roles button, and then let's just change that text from edit to create. Now let's take a look at this. And you can see now we have a create button. And when we click it, it goes to the create method. Okay, so that's all our buttons in place. In the next video, let's look at adding in some pagination. And we'll also build up our create, edit, and delete methods. Because at the moment, when you click them, it just goes to a blank page. And that's because we haven't built up their methods yet. So if you like this, don't forget to hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe so you get future updates. And if you can support me by following me on Twitter, or if you can buy me a coffee on my Patreon, the links are in the description. That'll be much appreciated.